Okay, you are a go.
All right, good morning, everyone. And this is, Andrew, this was not posted, obviously, right? Hello?
Yes, sir, it was posted publicly.
As a special board meeting?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, okay. All right. This is a special board meeting of the Board of Trustees of the Cananea Independent School District. Today is October 6th, 2020. The time is 8:37. And I guess, Ms. Camacho, would you please call roll, please?
Yes. Ms. Brigham.
Ms. Brigham?
You're on mute.
Okay,
Present, sorry.
that's okay.
Mr. Coronado.
Here?
Mr. Payan.
Here.
Mr. Rodriguez.
Present.
Mrs. Searles.
Mrs. Searles had indicated that she would not be joining us.
Okay. Mrs. Trout.
Present.
And Mrs. Iglesias.
Mrs. Iglesias also will not be joining us due to an illness.
Okay. Item 2, training workshop. The trustees will participate in a level 2 team building workshop. The workshop must include a review of the roles, rights, and responsibilities of the local board as outlined in the framework of government leadership and an assessment of continuing education needs of the board superintendent team. Cananea ISD board will continue discussions to amend the board operating procedures by adopting formal ethical standard for school board members to be included in Chapter 1, School Board Members Creed. Ms. Monica Haloma and AJ Cabra.
All right. Good morning. Ms. Haloma, are you there?
Good morning.
Good morning.
morning.
How are you?
Doing well. Thank you for having us this morning.
Good. Is Mr. Craybill on with you?
I am.
I see him.
Good morning. How are you, sir?
It's always good to be with you again.
Nice to
Good
be with you.
morning.
So I'll be sharing the presentation that we're going to be using today. This work is a continuation of a session where we started back in February to amend to review our board operating procedures. So can everybody see the screen? Do you
Yes.
see the presentation? All right. So our objective today is to amend the board operating procedures by adopting the formal ethical standards for school board members to be included in Chapter 1, your school board members creed. When we met, we started with one case scenario, and pretty much with that case scenario, you gave us specific information to go back and modify and define what recusal is. So Mr. Crable is going to be taking us through 4 more scenarios this morning. Once we have your information on those scenarios, Mr. Crable and I will go back and we will put everything together and we'll be presenting a document with you on those procedures. Okay.
Okay.
All right, Mr. Crable.
So one of the things that you all talked about last time that I want to pick up just as a way of framing our conversation is what's the difference between legal standards and ethical standards? What's the difference between legal standards and ethical standards? What do you remember from last time? Who'll be the first to share?
Well, if I may, legal standards actually have some legal consequences for breaking the rules. Those are mandated by law. Ethical standards are mandated by norms of whatever the organization, the community. So.
Well put.
Okay. And that, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think he made it very succinct. Well put, Mr. Coronado.
Who else? What do you remember? What are some of the key differences between legal standards and ethical standards? Anything else?
Blanca Trout, legal standards, of course, what the law tells us what to do and has consequences. And also ethical standards, that's the one that mandates and dictates the way that we need to behave, the way that we should behave is ethical. So we need to follow the rules of ethical standards. It's not legal, but it's ethical.
Well, why, if it's not legal, then why do we have to bother following them?
Well, we need to because ethically talks about our behavior.
Sir?
Yeah.
Ethical is a guidepost. Ethical is what Mr. Coronado said, but I think it's also, it's the societal norms that you might be living in. And if you're in the South, you have some societal norms. And if you live in the Northeast, you have others. And it's, you kind of have to, so those are more, it's not, I don't want to say word transient, they're localized to that area. Legal is pretty much black and white. This is what you have to do. And if you don't do it, then there's consequences or there's ramifications for your actions.
Is that a Boston accent?
Northeast El Paso. That's what I keep telling people, but yes, it is, sir.
Yeah, yeah. So the legality is going to be fairly consistent across the entire governmental spectrum. So if the federal law, what's legal is legal across the whole country. Texas law, what's legal is legal across the whole state. That's what I hear you saying. But I hear you saying that ethics might vary by community. Well, one community, maybe in the Northeast versus the Southwest, what they see as appropriate norms of behavior, really what they see as a collective set of rights and wrongs for their community. Hearing you say that might vary a little bit. Got it. Any other thoughts? What distinctions between legal and ethical, and why does the ethical matter if it's not the legal?
Sal Payan, I think one of the, I don't know, my view is ethical deals also with a lot of the morals that we expect people to adhere to, our moral behavior, our moral standards that we set as a community for each other.
Yeah, the common distinction between moral and ethical is that moral is really the personal definitions of right and wrongs, whereas ethical is really the collective definition. One way of thinking of ethics is our collective morality. But where morality is my personal sense of right and wrong, ethics is our collective sense of right and wrong. Absolutely. Any other thoughts?
I was just going to add on to that. It's just, it would be the expectations of the organization or of the district, right? It varies. It might vary even within a region from district to district as what those might be as well.
Yeah, this is a critical part, and this is really what brings us to our conversation today, is that each institution, each organization carries its own set of ethical expectations and standards. And that's just as true for school systems. And when it comes to school systems, the ethical norms start at the top. That the extent to which behavior is normalized by the board, that helps define for the rest of the organization what is appropriate, what is ethical behavior within our institution. And so if the board standard is here, then it's more likely you should expect that the staff standard is here. If the board standard is here, it's more likely that you should expect the staff standard to be here as well. That when we talk about the ethical norms for an organization, more often than not, the behavior of the leaders gives rise to the behaviors of the followers as well. Absolutely. And that is the nature of the conversation that we enter into today. Is you all have, as leaders, the responsibility to identify what are the behaviors that we think should be normal throughout the entire organization. So last time that we came together, you looked at one particular scenario. And what we did is we walked through that and talked through it and really digested it and engaged in it. In that particular scenario, we started off talking about a spouse selling pencils. You all remember this one?
Yes.
And so then not only did we look at that. But then we looked at a few more slices of it and said, okay, if we change it a little bit, then what is the ethical response? And if we change it a little bit more, then what's the ethical response? And if we change it a little bit more, then what's the ethical response? And you all gave a bunch of ideas around that. And so what Monica and I will do is, we're taking that and summarizing it, and we'll be able to craft a set of proposed board operating procedures based on what you all describe as what you think is the appropriate behavior in each scenario. And so that's what we're going to do as well today is, in addition to this first scenario feedback, we're going to dive into some additional scenarios with the same thing. We'll just add some different layers onto it, and we'll be listening and taking notes to figure out what things would we need to write down in policy in order to make sure that what you all believe is the right choice that for your organization, the ethical choice for your organization, gets codified in the policy procedures. After we've written that down, then we'll take a look at your existing board operating procedures and see if there's any difference between the two, and propose some modifications based on the difference we're seeing between what is currently in your operating procedures and what you all think should be in your operating procedures. Any questions about our process for today? Questions about our process? Well, then with that, we'll jump right into scenario number 2. So scenario number 2 is a board member who has been recognized by the board chair is speaking during a board meeting. Another board member who has not yet been recognized begins to speak simultaneously. How should the interrupted board member behave? How should the board as a whole respond? So imagine that, we have a board member who's been recognized by the board chair, we're in a board meeting, and another board member who's not yet been recognized to speak begins to speak simultaneously. How should the interrupted board member behave? And how should the board as a whole respond? Oh, so what are your thoughts? Who will be the first to share? How should the interrupted board member behave, and how should the board as a whole respond?
I believe the interrupted board member should actually ask the chair of the board to address the person that's interrupting.
Okay, so in this scenario, they've already interrupted. So you're saying they should interrupt again by asking, for permission to speak?
Or I would ask that the chair actually address the individual that interrupted.
So what should the chair say? What should the chair do?
The chair should say, "Can you please refrain from speaking?" And I'll let at your appropriate time, I'll let you address any concerns or questions you have. But please do not interrupt the individual that's speaking.
So the chair should interrupt the interrupter.
Yes.
Okay, Annette, what are you thinking?
Well, I know Mr. Coronado has been instrumental in doing this. And I do think what he has with his year as tenure that he has been trying to implement, I think it's right. He'll sometimes it gets ahead, he might be thinking of something else, but he does try to, and he does. He'll say, "You'll have a chance to speak. Let the other board member finish." And I respect, I think that has, it kind of puts us on hold. And because, sometimes when people say something, we want to, jump right in. That's just the nature of, especially with very independent and smart people. So, but I think the chair has the responsibility to just say, just like what Mr. Coronado says, you'll have an opportunity to speak. Let's, and then he'll say to the other board member, "Please continue." And I think that's totally appropriate. That's what I feel.
Who else? How should the interrupted board member behave? How should the board as a whole respond? Any other ideas? Yeah,
Blanca, definitely we need to respect the other one. The board chair is the one who's going to call us and tell us we need to allow the other board member to finish. The other board member has the floor, and just please wait until the person finish, and then you're going to be the next, if that person is the next, if not the one who was before that person. I think it's appropriate to let them know that you need to respect and you need to let the other board member to finish when he has or she has the floor. And the rest of the board, I mean, we need to adhere to that and listen that, because if we don't listen, then the other one is going to jump and then the other one and then the other one. That has been happening already.
Salvador?
I think, oh yeah, and Mr. Coronado has shown us a perfect example of what the process should be. He will correct the individual interrupting and ask to be respectful of the other individual that's already speaking. And I totally agree with that. Hey, ask the interrupter, hey, excuse me, the other person has the floor. Let them finish, and then you'll have an opportunity. And usually, when there's 2 or 3 people trying to speak, and you'll try to set a sequence where everybody gets a chance to speak. As a board, as a whole, I think we all have to be cognizant constantly that once somebody starts speaking, we need to respect that individual speaking. And when they finish, we need to ask the chair respectfully in appropriate manner, hey, Mr. Chair, I have a point to bring across. But as adults, as professionals, as board members, we all have to be cognizant again that we need to follow our turn and wait for the individual speaking to finish his speech.
No, you all have replied to the question that I didn't ask, which was how should the board chair respond? And I think that's appropriate. But you haven't responded to the questions I did ask, which are twofold. One, how should the interrupted board member behave? And 2, how should the board as a whole behave? And so in addition to you described the board chair's behavior, any behaviors that should be expected of other board members, and any particular behavior that should be expected of the interrupted board member?
I think as an interrupted board member, I think you should just call it to the attention of the interrupter. Excuse me, I have the floor. You'll get your chance when you speak. Now, as a board, and during the sequence of interruptions, I think we all need to look to the chair and say, you know what, because if we all start to interrupt, it's going to be chaotic.
Anyone else? What should the interrupted board member do? What should the rest of the board members do?
Well, I think the interrupted board member should not respond to the other board member who interrupted. I think the interrupted board member should seek correction from the chair about who has the floor. Because if we as a board member start responding to the interrupter in this case, then it becomes an issue of starting to basically talk over each other. And, I know, it shouldn't be like the debate last week, the presidential debate that,
Shut
Better
up.
than that.
I think that's a perfect example that, our president kept interrupting the other person when the other person had the floor to speak on the issue. The moderator tried to do that. And in that situation, I blame the moderator. And I also blame each of the candidates for not asking the moderator to take charge, because there were a set of agreed rules to that debate, just like there's a set of agreed rules to our board meeting. There's a set of agreed rules. One person's not following. And if you let if the interrupter starts to engage with the other individual that's interrupting, it just becomes like Sal said, it becomes chaotic. But like I said, in that situation, you got to have a chair. Like for example, the debate, there was a moderator who I think who lacked control of the debate, and I think it was primarily on him to have controlled it. you know, what you do is if the interrupter keeps interrupting and won't stop, then, you know, it said, we're going to stop the entire process until, you know, do that. We're not going to let you speak. We're going to, you know, or for whatever reason, these are agreed to rules of, you know, and, you know, obviously that debate has different, they don't have consequences, but in a board meeting, it can have consequences for the quote interrupter that doesn't want to cease. And that's,
Annette, I thought you were wanting to add a comment.
You know, that's a perfect example of how not to handle the situation, what the whole world, the whole country had to witness. It was painful. And the thing is that I have a little bit of concern is that when you're interrupted, and yeah, I think your instinct would be say, I have the floor, or your instinct would be to say, Mr. Chair, I have the floor. So I do think that sometimes there is a response for the interrupter, and there's sometimes that you just have to wait until somebody, you know, the chair comes in and says, okay, wait a minute, let's take a moment. And I know that's happened because you don't want to, if you're the one that has the floor, you don't want the chaos to assume like what happened last week with the presidential campaign is all they did is just yell over each other, you know, or totally get disengaged. It's very unnerving to hear somebody else talk. Maybe it's just with me because I'm ADHD. When somebody else is talking to try to stay focused on what you're trying to communicate, and the message can get really muddled really quickly.
So one of the things to always keep in mind as we're going through ethical conversations is that whatever happens in the boardroom echoes in the classroom. And so you keep that as something in the back of your mind, is that the behavior norm we adopt here, we're simultaneously giving permission for our students to behave in the way we behave. So if you are frustrated with students interrupting each other or being disrespectful of their instructors in the classroom, know that they will get their norms of behavior in part from the behavior of the board. So as you all describe how you want things handled in the boardroom, you're also giving subtle indications of how you'd want things handled in the classroom, how you'd want your students to behave. So with that in mind, sometimes these conversations happen publicly, but sometimes these conversations don't happen publicly. And so let's modify this scenario just a little bit. So in the original version of the scenario is like, what happens if this happens during a board meeting? But let's say scenario 2, part B, that it's no longer during a board meeting. Now it's during a closed session. Now how should the interrupted board member behave? And now how should the board as a whole respond? Previously, it was in a public meeting. Now it's during a closed session. So it's just the board members and whoever you pulled in a closed session. Now how should people respond?
I think the same thing applies. You got to
Why?
be respectful. You got to be respectful of everybody's chance to talk, especially even now and more so in a closed session, because then it becomes an issue of you know, people talking over each other, and you can't have a discussion when our people are talking with each other, and some people are going to miss somebody's points. And so I think it's especially true in the boardroom as well.
And else, now it's a closed session, not a public session. Now,
Yes.
how should people respond? Other ideas?
I think we need to, oh, I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
I think we
Go
need
for it,
to, thank you. Thank you. When we are in closed session, of course, the board chairs start to talk and start to say, someone would like to say something. And then there's really no order like in the board, or you gotta be recognized, but we need to have an ethical behavior and say, you know what, my colleague is talking right now, we need to wait, but if I interrupt, you know what, I kindly say, you know what, please let me finish, I do have the floor. And it's something that I would like to address, because for my point of view, I think it is important and interesting that everyone could hear or listen. So we need to behave. And if someone is interrupted, I think I will say, please, I do have the floor. Let me finish my statement, and then you will continue.
Salvador?
I think I agree with Mr. Coronado. We have to adhere to the same rules and procedures as a formal board open on the public, because my experience in being straightforward, when you're in a private session and in closed session, people get a lot more personal with each other, and things go off the rail then, and nothing gets done. And really, I agree with Mr. Coronado. We need to follow a set of rules and adhere to them. As we did in a public session, we need to do it in a private session, closed session.
Mr. Crable,
Hey, Jay.
AJ, I have a question. What if it's
Yeah.
not verbal disruption?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's so I didn't mention what the nature of the disruption was. You know, maybe somebody hops up and starts doing jumping jacks on top of the table. Like, so what's the appropriate response? Annette, get off the table, certainly, but
After they tell me to get off the table, AJ, I agree with what Sal said, that, and I think that could be a goal that we could all work on, is when it goes into executive session, you know, and maybe by just saying that we're in executive session, because, you know, you're still in a board meeting. You still have a specified agenda that has been written, you know, I mean, not the details of the executive session, but the topic of the executive session has been written. And the community expects us to be discussing that executive, you know, that topic. So I agree with what Sal said. I think maybe it would just be, okay, everybody take a break, go get yourself something to drink, and then, okay, let's all sit and almost have a formalization to start the process, you know, because that gets us back in the mindset of we're at the, you know, at an official function.
yeah, this is akin to what Sergio said a little bit earlier, is that if this type of behavior continues, his instinct is that it might be appropriate to call for a brief recess and just stop the whole, you know, process. And, you know, so to Armando's, you know, inquiry, I think that is a reasonable, I think it's a reasonable thing to do. I know I've, you know, when I was chairing my board, I think it only happened once, where I called a recess because it just felt like the energy was so tense that we weren't in our right minds in thinking meaningfully. So, you know, let the record show that, you know, Annette hops on the table, starts doing jumping jacks. The appropriate response is to call for
Finish.
call for a quick recess. You know, tell everybody to calm down, and then hopefully restart. We've talked about this a little bit. It sounds like you all have some shared ideas about how you want that handled. And I think, again, Monica and I will be able to write that up. You know, let's look at an entirely different scenario. So, you know, in scenario 3, you know, the board chair's opinion, a board member just raised their voice to an unprofessional volume at another board member during a board meeting.
Or you want something?
How should the board member respond? How should the board chair respond? So in the board chair's opinion, a board member just raised their voice to an unprofessional volume at another board member during a board meeting. How should the board member respond? Who will be the first to share?
I don't mind sharing, AJ.
All right.
Okay, I'm going to say that Mr. Coronado had to do this with me. and you know what? And it works. He just says, and you know, all he said, and it worked beautifully. He goes, Miss Brigham, just a moment. But Miss Brigham, and all he has to do is just say Miss Brigham. We worked that out, you know what I mean? And he does. And you know what? It's and you just kind of have to go into self-correct mode, you know? So I do think he has done a really good job at that. You know, just call attention, don't make a big deal out of it. And then hopefully the board member will, you know, because especially if the chair says it, you know, because even there's times when I'd say, oh, well, what about, and he'd say, yes, Miss Brigham, you know, and you know what, it just brings it down. And so I just think by a very correct, what's the right word, courteous approach, that worked beautifully.
Thank you. Who else? In scenario 3, in the board chair's opinion, a board member just raised their voice to an unprofessional volume at another board member during a board meeting. How should the board chair respond? Who else?
My sense is that, and I agree with Ms. Brigham, that the board chair should professionally and respectfully call the board member to attention to calm down and respond or act according to professional norms and calm the situation down, not in a threatening or unprofessional manner.
Yeah, so you, by describing that, what you're suggesting is that there's a particular skill set that the board chair should have to be able to intervene in these moments. So are you
Absolutely.
suggesting that if a board member doesn't possess the skills to do what you just described, that the board should not consider the board?
You're breaking up.
Yeah, Mr.
Yep,
Crapo,
sir.
you're breaking up. We didn't hear the last couple sentences.
So what you're describing outlines a very specific and fairly advanced skill set for a meeting facilitator. And you're saying that all of that should fall on the shoulders of the board chair. So are you suggesting that if a board member doesn't have the skill set to do what you just described, that the board shouldn't consider them as a board chair?
I would say absolutely so. Because if he doesn't have the skill set to be able to manage and control or manage a board meeting, and things get out of hand, and he has no skill sets or no managerial skill sets to be able to control a meeting, absolutely, I don't think the board should consider that.
So the reason I put this out here is because as we're going through these scenarios, you all are putting a whole lot of expectation on the board chair. And so I just want to push back and highlight what the practical implications are of having all these expectations of the board chair. I'm not suggesting you're right or wrong in having those expectations. I just want you to be thinking through all the angles while you sort through these scenarios. Who else?
Mr. Crapo?
Yeah.
Well, and I think in that respect, it's, even though any board member may not have those requisite skills, I think that's why I think there has to be a plan to develop board members to be able to do that. In terms of people get on the board, we should start giving them proper training so that everybody eventually could be able to do the job of the board chair in the way that is expected from the board. And that takes, I guess, focus that every board member, whether it be at conferences, whether we have particular, have other board presidents. I know Mr. Ramos has started doing something like that, as a matter of fact, on his own, to be able to share from other board presidents. But I think we ought to start doing it with all board members. And I think the basis of it really is, initially, is what we're trying to do here is the board operating procedures, is how we're going to manage this. And above and beyond that, who should run the meetings and how should they run the meetings is part of the answer. And I think we need to start as a board thinking how we're going to be developing board members to be able to do that. So it's not just one person all the time or a few people all the time. And I think we need to do that and expect that board members go to these types of trainings. And, we have a certain purpose behind our board operating procedures that every board member should start to learn how to run a board meeting.
That's a good point.
Did you hear that,
AJ?
Monica? We're gonna have to develop a new training where you and I yell at new board members until they figure out how to handle it. So I'm looking forward to working out that training with you. It's gonna be a good time. Yes, Salvador.
But one of the things that people and don't take into account when they go to a board or go to run for a board or get on a board. And the other board members realize this too late, is they've got an agenda when they get on a board. And politically, they play to that audience by being and not being able to manage a meeting and taking into consideration the other board members' I don't know what you want to call it, agenda, but I think part of the training, if we're going to have a training, is people need to understand you put aside those political leanings when you get on the board, and you're going to work as a team on the board. Because a lot of times people play to the public audience politically as a chair. I'm not saying Mr. Coronado does that, but I've seen it numerous times before where it's not about doing what's good for the community, what's being good for the school district or the organization for that matter, but what's good for them personally, politically, to be able to advocate for a certain agenda, whether it be for the employees, for the teachers, for an organization that is pushing them to do certain things. So that individual or the board members, when they're going to select a board member, they need to take all these things into consideration, that certain people are going to have a political agenda or a political audience, and they're not going to be able to, they're going to favor certain members of the board that share that agenda, that ideology. So I think, and I don't know if it's inherent on people that no matter how much you train them, they're going to go that route no matter what.
Well,
And
so
that's
this
what we need to take into account.
And so I certainly don't think the board will have the authority to manage people's ideologies. I've trained hundreds upon hundreds of board members, and I have yet to meet one that doesn't have an agenda, myself included. What I do think that you have the authority to do is manage board members' behavior. And so, I think it is reasonable for you all to expect, here is how people will behave, particularly when they're in a board meeting. Here is the standard of expectation. And so, but I do think it's on you all as a board to really clearly articulate what that standard is. So if you have some additional, and Salvador, it sounds like you have some additional thoughts about this, and just know that any of you are welcome to shoot Monica and I an email, with any additional thoughts that occur to you on these scenarios, even after this conversation. But if you have some really fine tuned ideas about what are behaviors that should and shouldn't be acceptable, new board members come on, because I think we've all seen this. People get elected, a little bit excited about being an elected official for the first time, and they have that new elected official smell, and so they can kind of get a little bit worked up. And I think the question is, what are the specific behaviors we expect out of them, whether we agree or disagree with their ideology? What is the set of behaviors we should expect out of every single one of our new folks coming on board? And so give that some thought. And if you have some specific ideas, like I said, feel free to shoot us an email so that we can have that as part of the collective notes we're taking, and so that we can try to recommend some ideas back to you of what modifications you could make. Annette, you had some thoughts?
I'm going back to what Sal and Mr. Coronado said. As coming from a building principal for 10 years, you had to be able to walk in front of an audience and in front of, whether it was a grade level of 6 teachers or whether it was a faculty of 45 teachers. And some of the things that what I think you were alluding to, AJ, is there was, the trainer of trainer models where you train people how to do that. And one of the things, and I know Monica might remember this, do you remember one of the best in-services a couple of them went to was Crucial Conversations. And I brought that to my CIC because, if you've ever, a CIC talk about, it could be just like a board meeting. I'm sorry, guys. And you have the ones that, and going back to what Sal said, agendas, the fourth grade, we're the most important, we're doing this, and we're, and the sixth grade, or, and then, good Lord, the kindergartners. So, I mean, and one of the things, there was a couple of crucial conversations was, I'm telling you, a game changer for creating a new middle school that people had respect for each other.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, so I'm just saying that was an excellent one. And then the trainers model as far as leadership. And I think Mr. Coronado is absolutely right. You're getting people on that may have been, they could have been in the PTA or the PTO. They work in, some of them have supervisory roles, but people that come on the board may not have a supervisory role. They might not have ever had one.
Yeah.
And I think to absolutely like create a strand, of leadership, but also begin at a level of conversation. Because I do think, and it doesn't have to be as in-depth as, a crucial conversation, but if we could do something like maybe, a 3-hour workshop on that, and how to respond, especially like says, I hear that you're passionate about this, or I hear your anger. How can I help make it, I think if we give people those few words of vocabulary, it sounds contrite and staged in the beginning, but once you get a whole team doing it, it's a totally different outcome.
Sergio, what you wanted to happen?
Sure. And one thought about that is that I think after, and I think it's really after every board election, and we have one every 2 years. So I think we ought to, instead of doing the team building somewhere down the year, I think we have to have something similar to that.
Yeah.
Right after the board election, when people get seated, before they start getting ideas of other, is to
Yes.
try and get the team on the same path and get these new board members into getting some kind of a training along those lines. But I think one of the first issues should be is obviously we need to have some kind of I guess initial immersion for the board members. A lot. I remember when I got on the board, is a lot to take in initially.
Yeah.
A lot to take in. We're a very regulated agency of the government, super regulated. And so I think to that respect, we kind of need to establish some kind of initial orientation to give the board member a little overview of everything that goes on. And then once they get that initial orientation and training, then we do a team building right away. Because some board members, when they first get on, don't understand either the legalities,
Mhm.
the norms, and the ethics that go into the organization. And so before those problems arise, and not to any of their fault, it's just that they haven't been made aware of all
Just
that.
haven't been trained. Yeah.
True.
So I think that's where we should really focus our start to developing a game plan for this.
Yeah, this idea of being proactive and doing some training up front, but also some team building. How do we bring ourselves together as a team? I think that makes a lot of sense. I want to add another wrinkle onto this. So in this scenario, we talked about what happens when board members raise their voice at each other. What happens? It's no longer raising their voice at another board member. Now it's raising their voice at a staff member during a board member. Now, how should the board member respond? How should the board chair respond? It's no longer raising their voice at another board member. Now they're raising their voice at a staff member during a board meeting. Now, how should the board chair respond? If board members are raising their voice at a staff member, it's any staff member. It could be the custodian, it could be a teacher, it could be a superintendent, it could be, food service worker. If the board member raised their voice at a staff member during a board meeting, how should the board chair respond? Blanca?
I think the board member has the control of the board meeting, and the board chair, he could call the board member and let him know, or let him or let her know in that moment that is out of control or is out of place, and he needs or she needs to remain quiet until there's appropriate time to address whatever the situation they need to address. But the board member the board chair who has the control of the board meeting, I think he has a whole authority to let us know that we need to wait until the appropriate time and the appropriate avenue to address this situation.
Thank you, Blanca. Who else? Board member is raising their voice at a staff member during a board meeting. How should it
AJ?
be handled? Yeah, so,
I think the board chair should immediately call it to the attention of the board member that it's an inappropriate action to take. That staff member has a line of supervision, and if anybody's going to do any correction or any admonishing or any kind of comment towards a staff member, that should be addressed through, I'm sorry. That should be.
Call from Washington, D.C.
Could be the
From
president.
the White
I'm
House,
sorry.
the White House. The White House.
Trump calling you back?
That's why the superintendent and the assistant superintendent and the principals have a role. That staff member that might be at a board meeting on his own to address an issue in public forum or to present an agenda item, an issue on an agenda item, he's been directed or should have been directed by the board or the superintendent to address the board member on a certain item. It's not for us to admonish them or raise our voice to any staff member at any time. Now, the chairman should immediately call it to the board member's attention and tell them, it's inappropriate. You shouldn't do that. You can't do that.
But wait a minute, you're the board, aren't you all in charge?
No,
The board chair. But the
So the
board
board chair
members,
can yell at the
the
staff
board
member.
members should be aware of the fact that they, under no circumstances do they raise their voice to a staff member. Never.
But you're in charge. Why can't you raise your voice?
we're not in charge.
We're
Is that
not.
ethical?
That's
We're
why-
not a,
That's what we pay the superintendent for.
Oh, so you can raise your voice at the superintendent then?
No,
Well, you're in charge of the
Neither.
superintendent,
No.
right? So,
you do it professionally and tell
yes, agreed.
the board member, you know what? The chairman does that, not the other board members. But as a board member,
so the
you
chairman
need to,
can yell at the superintendent.
no,
Not even
the-
yell.
I
No,
nobody yells
AJ,
at
you know,
want to know who gets to do the yelling around here, people.
AJ, if I may, I do think I have been, when I was an employee, a victim of that exact same thing, of board members yelling, not yelling, just being real sarcastic and condescending to me or somebody that was presenting. And it was very, I'm tough. It didn't bother me as much, but I know when I had a teacher that they did it to, and I said, it does have effect. What the board does may affect people. And I'm going to go back to what, we have seen our board in absolutely horrific conditions, and we have seen it on the mend. I'd like to say we're on the mend. Okay. So what that is going back to what Mr. Coronado said and what Sal said, is professional, courteous communication. Our job is absolutely, we do not yell at staff. It's difficult for us when things get heated for us not to raise our voices with each other. And that's why, we definitely need to be reminded and trained on that. But, our job we have two employees, which is the auditor and then the superintendent, but that does not mean we can yell at them either, sir. We can, if there's something that we need to be pinpointed, you know what, there's such a thing as, make an appointment or, or talk to them off mic or off that, because how do you blend of an atmosphere of professionalism and courtesy when you even divert from it sometimes? So I think that I don't think anyone, to answer your question when you were saying that, we really shouldn't be yelling at, we have no right to yell at any employee or each other.
So I want to lift up something you just said. Monica, would you mind bringing up scenario 3C? If you could refresh and bring up 3C right quick, because the issue that you just brought up is kind of another issue I want to bring before the board. All right, so now in this scenario, it's no longer a board member raising their voice at a staff member during a board meeting, but it's a board member being condescending or sarcastic to a staff member during a board meeting. The question is, in that scenario, how should the board chair respond? And so what we have is a situation where the board member is no longer raising their voice, but being condescending or sarcastic. In that scenario, how should the board chair respond?
You went right into my question, didn't you?
You walked right into the scenario. Stop reading the slides. Stop reading ahead.
Yeah, I have nothing to read ahead. You're right, AJ, is being condescending or sarcastic is a form of abuse. Mm-hmm. Bottom line. And so again, it's not, I used to say to my teachers, sarcasm is not a form of communication. Even if it's those little one-liners they slip in there,
So if the board chair, in the board chair's opinion, there's a board member is being condescending or negatively sarcastic toward a staff member, how should the board chair respond?
The board has a set of norms on behavior. And when, like I said, when Mr. Coronado says, calls and says, Miss Brigham, immediately I know, okay, something that I said probably was on some type of borderline of not the appropriate behavior, even though it might not have sounded like that to me. I have to respect that and I'll try to bring it down. And I think if the norms of a training, as you were saying, sir, is saying how we communicate, the only thing we're available to communicate is that message that's sent out. We have no control on how it's received. We have no control on how it's received. If we see that it's received in a negative manner, we have to clarify or we have to communicate again. So I think the board chair at that time, if he he or she, they have the ability to say, okay, Mr. Payan or Miss Brigham, or, whatever it is, whoever it could be, Miss Iglesias, Miss Searles, whoever it is. And then all of a sudden we know when that's said that the norm is, whoa, there's a red flag, we need to bring it down. It's like those keywords, like when you're training kids, or you're training people in leadership, you're going to say, like you just said, set the bar, and you're going to have to do that. And I think we could do that, and especially with training, what Mr. Coronado was saying about new board members coming in. Can you imagine how powerful that training would be if they got it right away? So I do think, well, sarcasm is just, there's no place for sarcasm. And condescending is the same thing. I think if we had a norm that when the chair, whoever the chair would be, said something, the key word, or just referred to the board member by their name or title, that would be enough to bring it down an octave.
Armando, what are you thinking? Haven't heard from you in a little bit.
Oh, exactly. What I was going to go is, not only is it a form of abuse, but it's also somebody's character. So how do you really change somebody's character? And I guess that's a more difficult thing because we've seen it. Like, it's not, if you're condescending, or if you're not respecting an employee, or you're not respecting a board member, it's a consistent behavior. And how are you supposed to address it? I mean, we continue to have the same problem. It's not, I mean, it looks pretty right now because we're in election season, but tell you what, once election's over, you know, the behavior is going to continue. And so where is that accountability, or what is it that needs to happen?
So what specific behavior would you want the board chair to exhibit in that situation?
Well, I mean, it's not the board chair. He's tried his, you know, but it's consistent behavior from certain individuals, right? We've seen it not only, you talk about verbal, nonverbal, but we also see it in written communication to the superintendent. And
Yeah.
so that's not going to change. I mean, I can't change somebody else, any of my colleagues. I mean, we could hold them accountable,
No,
maybe
so
censorship,
you
but what?
certainly, the question,
Fading in and out, AJ.
You're breaking up, Mr. Craven.
yeah, no, I've got a bad connection today, apparently. People need to stop using my Wi-Fi. So what is the specific behavior you would want from the board or the board chair in moments when you felt like staff were being abused by board members? That's what I'm listening for. Anyone. What
I
is
mean,
the specific behavior?
I would want the board chair to call out the misbehavior, but it consistently happens. It's not, how do you change the board member? I mean, the board chair could, you know,
So they've called it out and nothing's changed. So now what?
That's a guidance I would, I mean, what I would do is I would either censor the board, censor the board member. I don't know what else, but then you're getting into, I just, right, like I said, right now it's looking nice and pretty in the camera while we're in a Zoom meeting, but once election season's over, the behavior is going to continue. We've seen it. So what do you recommend? I mean, that's a guidance I'm asking for.
Essentially what he's asking, Monica, would you mind jumping way ahead to scenario 5B? Because this is essentially what I hear, Armando asking is, the board has concerns about repeated unethical behavior of a board member. What should the board chair do? What should the board as a whole do? Which privileges should the board member lose? So since you all just keep jumping ahead of my slideshow, so now two of you are guilty of it. So the question is, we're seeing this repeated unethical behavior. The behavior has not changed. What should the board chair do? What should the board as a whole do? Which privileges should the board member lose?
Which privileges can a board member lose under the law?
Thank you. Right, thank you.
I mean, in Texas, we don't have the capabilities.
So let's distinguish. What are board member rights and what are board member privileges? Rights are, what are board member rights that they cannot lose, and what are board member privileges that are extended to board members but aren't actually rights? So, if you're taking notes, write 2 columns, one that's labeled privileges and one that's labeled rights. What are examples of board member rights? What are examples of board member privileges?
Well, the board, AJ, if I may, the board member always has the right to vote on issues.
They have a right to vote. That is absolutely a board member right. What are other board member rights or board member privileges?
The right to speak.
To a degree, they have the right to speak if other board members have been afforded the right to speak.
To be recognized.
Yeah. if other board members have been recognized, then they have the right to be recognized as well.
Yes. Mhm.
And so you can't say, well, this board member can speak, but that one can't. But if no
Exactly.
board members, are recognized, then so be it. So I wouldn't describe necessarily that they have a right to speak as much as I would describe that they have a right to be treated to speak equal to what's been
Equally.
afforded their colleagues.
Yes.
All right, what are other rights versus privileges? If you're speaking, Armando, you're muted. Anyone else? What are other board member rights versus board member privileges?
So in regards to, I guess, the Robert's Rules of Order, which is pretty much, and let's say a board member gets their privilege of 2 to 3 minutes, right? I mean, let me go back. I'm trying to look at the question. Can we put on the screen the actual question? Thank you, Ms. Helen. And we're looking at privileges versus,
What's a board member privilege? What's a board member right? So let's keep, before we get into anything else, let's first populate these two lists. What are examples of privileges that board members have in Canantillo that are not rights? And what are example of rights that board members have that cannot be withdrawn?
Honestly, don't know any.
Right to information.
So board members have a rock solid right to information without having to submit a public information request. As long as they're acting in their authority as a board member, of course, and there are a few other wrinkles within the law. But generally speaking, if they're acting in good faith in their authority and it's information that is susceptible to the Public Information Act. I mean, there's some criteria, but in general, board members have a very powerful and nearly inalienable right to to documents that currently exist. That is.
Can you repeat that?
Right. Board members have it does have limits, but in practice, it's a fairly unlimited right to documents that already exist. That last part being a critical distinction between rights and privileges. So what else? What are other examples of board member rights or what are examples of privileges that are currently extended to board members but aren't actually rights?
What about the legal aspect, like a legal, not protection maybe, or consultation?
So the question is, do board members individually have the right to access legal services for the district?
Yes, exactly.
So that's a question. Is that a right or a privilege?
I think, AJ, you have to,
Privilege, I guess.
I think you have to define, they have to have a common definition. What is a right and what is a privilege?
Yeah, so that's what we're talking about. So rights are things that are afforded under law that can't be revoked. Privileges is basically everything else.
Yeah.
So the question that Blanca had asked was, do board members have a right to legal services through the district?
I think it's a right.
So the question is that defined in law? If it is, then that makes it a right. If it's not, then that makes it a privilege.
Oh.
So is it a right or a privilege?
I think it's a privilege.
It's a right. It's a right.
I think board members confuse or mix rights and privileges.
That's why we're distinguishing the two.
That's why I'm confused.
Anybody else? Is this a right or a privilege?
AJ, may I?
Yeah.
Well, the board as a whole has a right.
The board definitely has a right.
The board has a right to legal counsel and communication with legal counsel. Individual
that was not the question.
board members do not.
Yeah, so this is a distinction. As you got, I'm not asking about the board as a whole. That's the point. Yes, Sergio just lifted up. Is my question was, what are board member rights versus board member privileges? You know, the board as a whole has vast power that board members don't have.
Firing the superintendent.
Yeah, so yeah, that is not a board member right, nor is it a board member privilege.
Right.
The job.
But let's talk about the superintendent. Meeting with the board, meeting with the superintendent. Is that a board member right or a board member privilege?
It's a privilege.
Privilege. I agree with Mondo on that one.
Well,
Except maybe for the chair. You know, if the chair is setting the agenda, and I think then it's more right because they have to, it's set in policy that they meet and that they're going to set the agenda up and stuff like that. You can see that in policy. But meeting with the superintendent, I think I have to agree with Mondo. I think, you know, it's time. His time is to run the district, and it takes time if we knock on the door or make a phone call or we try, you know. So I think that's a privilege.
Other thoughts?
I believe if it's factual information, like you're saying, if it's documents already, I mean, what are you meeting with the superintendent for, right? Are you meeting of something that's, you know, let's say a technical question that is in regards to an agenda item for a board meeting? Yes, I think you should have that right. Now,
That is not a right under law.
no, I know it's not a right, but in regards to,
So what we're distinguishing, is it a right or a privilege?
okay. My previous is a privilege.
Yeah, it's a privilege. There's nothing in statute that I've ever read that enshrines that as a right. There's no individual board member who has that as a right. The board chair does not have that as a right. What happens is the board as a whole has said that we want our board chair to set the agenda. And so the board chair is authorized by the board to set the agenda. But even that, when you go look at your policies, it probably doesn't say, you know, the board chair directs the board chair to sit down and meet with the superintendent. That's probably not what your policies and procedures say. It probably says the board chair is expected to, you know, work with the superintendent to set the agenda. But it probably doesn't actually say anything about meeting. And so the board has vast rights that really can't be hampered. But board members, not so much. So who else? What are other examples of rights versus board member rights versus board member privileges?
Well, under certain limitations, the right to, it would be a privilege to set agenda items.
Yeah, so I don't see anything in Texas statute that that indicates individual board members have any authority over the board's agenda. That is a board. The board has authority over the board agenda.
Right.
But I don't know that individual board members have the unilateral authority over the board agenda.
Going back to the agenda, it's not a right, but in your policy, you, let's say, have where you could have three board members request an agenda item. That's still not right. It's just a privilege. That's
no,
been
so in that situation, you have modified your policies to extend a right where previously only a privilege existed. But that is a local decision that you have made. You've extended a right to board members where previously only a privilege existed. That's what you've accomplished.
So let's go looking at pulling an agenda item from consent agenda. And what we did was you had to do your homework and call the superintendent before. And that was sort of extended like a local right? So
you all absolutely, as a matter of your own policies and procedures, can enshrine board member rights into your policies. You absolutely have that authority, but board members don't have that authority. The board has that
As a
authority.
whole.
And so that's how the board has used its authority to extend rights to board members. But absent the board doing so, these are largely privileges of board members, not rights in statute of board members.
Thanks for clarifying that. Will be beneficial.
I'm not sure. Mondo, I'm not sure I didn't follow that, AJ. I mean, I understood what Mondo
What?
said, but I didn't understand your answer, AJ. I'm sorry.
Armando, you want to describe?
Yeah, the board voted
Please.
for it as a constraint that you have to call superintendent or staff to address any agenda item that's on consent agenda, and you cannot pull it from consent agenda if you have not done your homework.
Okay, the AJ? May I?
Yeah, so essentially the board has the authority, not absolute authority. There's some areas that it would get in trouble, but the board does have the authority to regulate board member behavior through its own policies and procedures. And it sounds like that's what you all have chosen to do.
But I have a question, AJ.
Yeah.
And that specific one, and Mondo, thanks for bringing it up. But if you look also, I guess, and you know what, you're getting me now to think about a fine line that I never thought about, AJ, before, as far as where is it? Is it in policy? Is it whether it's in local or legal? And I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know.
Yeah.
But like when things are on the consent agenda, there are some things that either you do ask a question, or it's administration's usually very good about trying to answer it, but sometimes their answer created other questions.
Mm-hmm.
And then also too, is if you look at consent agenda, it's for normal items. It's not for like things that maybe off the rails, or it's and that's described in the now I don't know whether it's local policy or if it's anything else. So I do think, and that's one of my biggest bugaboos that I have, is that it seems like it's taken away the ability of the board member to question it all. And it sets precedent, when all of a sudden you said, okay, you get 2 minutes, and you've already read it. You've read it twice. And the first time you read it was not a problem. The second time I read it, says, I don't know if I understood that. And, I do think that if they just do a carte blanche and throw everything on a consent agenda, you're going to have people ask questions. So, and like I said, the administration's great about answering it, but sometimes they answer it with such a detail that now you have another question.
Yeah, I think the key thing that you're getting to is that the board does have the right to describe in its policies and procedures expected behaviors of board members. And the key thing the board has to do is it has to apply those equally across board members. It's not appropriate to apply things for one board member and not apply it for other board members. So when the board says this is the standard of behavior, whatever that standard is, as long as the board is applying it across the board for all board members, and it's not forbidden by Texas statute, then the board generally has the authority to do so. And so the behaviors that you're describing, if to the extent that those exist in your current policy, I haven't heard you describe anything that is inconsistent with I am not an attorney. I just read a whole lot of policy, and I haven't heard you describe anything that's inconsistent with policy.
AJ,
I want to get back. Any other examples of board member rights or any other specific examples of board member privileges? I don't want to lose this thread of conversation. Any other rights that board members have versus privileges that board members have?
So I just, AJ, if I might, in regards to the board members gave a right to individual board members to pull an agenda item if they've asked questions before. I think the question here is that I'll disagree. The problem is for far too long, Canotio has, the mindset has been, you know, before it was the purchasing power of 10,000, we wanted to approve anything under 10,000. We've moved it up to 50,000. But the other issue is the agenda item, what's put on consent agenda is something that could be questioned before. And previously, if it's more than, you know, 50, or let's say if it was 100,000, then you would not have it on the consent agenda. But I think the mindset of the district is looking at different districts, and that's, I mean, it's been given that right for board members, but, you know, I think that the crux of the issue is that people still want to dictate the agenda like it was previously done, and we've changed that to allow us to focus on student outcomes.
So what I'm still not actually hearing is, what are other examples of board member privileges? What are other examples of board member rights? Does anybody else have examples?
AJ, would it be the right to dissent?
Yeah. Board members absolutely have the right to vote yes or no or abstain on any item. Absolutely, that is a right. They cannot be compelled to vote one way or the other. Anyone else? Examples of rights or
The right to
privileges?
set the tax rate.
The board members do not have the right to set the tax rate.
So no, but on the board, you said board members' rights and board rights.
No, I said board members' rights, board member
Board
privileges.
members' rights.
Board member rights, board member privileges.
Privileges. I'm having a hard time with privileges, AJ.
Yeah, it's because we normally don't think of it that way. There's a whole bunch of privileges you all enjoy that you have absolutely no right to, but that just wind up getting extended to you as rights because that's a reasonable way to behave. But the question that Armando brought up is, what authority does the board have to regulate board member behavior? And for me, a large part of that answer comes down to what privileges are you extending, and to what extent have board members honored the ethical framework such that they should continue having those privileges extended. So anyone else, examples of privileges versus rights for individual board members? Do board members have the right to be on district property?
No. Not without permission, I don't believe.
Anyone else? Thoughts? Do board members have a right to be on district property? Is this a right or a privilege?
Privilege.
That's privilege.
So the answer is it depends. So if you're having a board meeting on district property,
Oh, yeah.
the board members clearly have a right to be on district property.
Okay, okay.
So you can't really bridge a board member's right to attend a board meeting. And so if it's being hosted on district property, then they definitely have a right to be there.
The right to education, CEC, continuing education individually. Right? Yeah, board member, right?
I don't know. I have to check that.
AJ, what about calling, AJ, what about calling staff for information?
Is that a right or a privilege?
Privilege.
Privilege.
Yeah, board members have no right to call staff. Do you have the right to call, calling a superintendent is a right or a privilege?
A right. No, that's a person you. So
why would a board member have any rights regarding the superintendent's time?
Well, because that's an individual you oversee, right?
The board members don't oversee the superintendent.
I mean, not.
Oh, I get it. The board corporate oversees.
Board
Not
members
the
are not the
individual.
boss of the superintendent.
Yeah.
Board members are not, the board chair is not, the board vice chair is not, board members are not the boss of the superintendent. The board is, board members are not.
The board corporate, okay.
Yeah, you start to think about it. There's a whole lot of privileges out here they exist invisibly because it's just kind of the way we've always operated. But when you get down to it, the board has almost unlimited rights. Board members actually have very few rights.
AJ, I think
Now, those rights are pretty powerful. Your right to show up at board meetings, the right to vote, the right to participate in board meetings, the right to ask for information, that already exists. Do board members have a right to information that doesn't exist?
Well, they shouldn't have to create it.
no.
If it has to be created, you do not have a right to it. Board members do not. The board does. The board has the right to whatever they ask for.
The board information, yeah, at the board.
If it currently exists, with very few exceptions, board members absolutely have a right to it. But documents that don't exist, say, hey, superintendent, could you put together a report on this? Is that a board right or a board privilege?
Privilege.
That is absolutely a board member privilege. I'm sorry, is that a board member right or a board member privilege? That is absolutely a board member privilege. Why are we taking time to distinguish between rights, board member rights and board member privileges? Why are we taking the time to distinguish between these two?
So we get a better understanding of our role.
It's helpful to have an understanding of your role. Why else?
Well, the rights are listed and defined, I guess, by law, it sounded like, and the privileges as I've told you before, I'm having a little bit of difficulty with that. But I guess the rights are a statute, was given to us in statute.
Absolutely. So why are we bothering to list out the privileges then?
Because I think privileges having a historical meaning. For example, Ms. Brigham, you were an associate soup, and you were so used to the board only knowing what they know.
Absolutely.
And so you, as a board member now, that's the way it was always done.
Absolutely.
And so now we move from a privilege to a board member thinking that it's the right because it's always been done this way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Galaviz.
As new members come in, they start to act that way. That privilege, thinking that it's a right.
I don't know if it's Mr. Rodriguez has said it's like historical, you know what I mean? And I think sometimes historical things might not be based in statute. And that's what, if we can't find a base in statute, that's when it's a right versus a privilege.
I apologize, AJ.
Yeah.
One of our board members has to take something up that just came up. I guess it's some kind of emergency, but he has to take a break for about an hour. This is actually a team building. We all need to be here, but even though some of our board members are not, I don't know, how do you want to handle this?
So are you saying we're about to lose a quorum?
We're about to lose one of our board members.
Well, so we're already missing 2 of our board members. So this definitely does not count as a team building session.
Right, so.
So whether or not you want to continue with 4 board members, I leave that to your judgment. Largely.
No, I think we should continue. This is very helpful, so.
It is helpful.
So, and I think we need to have this discussion. So.
All right. So real quick, Monica, could you put 5B back up? So now that we've identified some privileges, now I need help answering the scenario in 5B.
AJ?
Yes.
I don't know how to answer the last one. What privileges should the board member lose? I could answer what should the board chair do, again, by setting up the norms, and if it's when he says, you're out of order, you know, when the chair says, you know, Ms. Brigham, you're out of order.
Yeah. So
you know,
essentially what I'm asking you is, do you want your policy to have teeth or not?
Right. And I think that might be, and then what should the board do as a whole? I think the board should do as a whole is listen to what the chair just said, you know, like you said, and if the policy has enough teeth in it. I don't know how to answer the last part of that question. But I'm having to deal with privileges. So
Yeah, the last question is the question of, will your policy have teeth or not? If you don't answer the last question, let me assure you, your policy will not have teeth.
that's why I'm having trouble.
This is great, if I might, Mr. Chair or AJ.
Yeah.
I think this gives us a better understanding of what those privileges are. And I think if you do not act in a professional manner, you should lose those privileges. And your only way is to request that at a board meeting, or if it's on a consent agenda, then you would request it that way. Do you get what I'm saying, AJ?
I hear what you're saying. I'm wondering if your colleagues hear what you're saying.
Okay, Mando, could you repeat that again, please? I'm sorry.
So the privileges that we currently have, you would only be limited if you do not know how to respect your colleague or administration or staff, then you should lose all privileges. And the only privileges you would have is the ones we currently have. Let's say if we do have an agenda item, you could ask questions on that agenda item.
Okay.
If you don't ask questions on that agenda item, then you can't pull the agenda item. The other is, if you wanted to request an agenda item, you would have to have two other colleagues to actually put an agenda item. And that's pretty much some of the basic rights basic rights under our local policy, not including the rights that Mr. Craybill discussed.
I understand what you just said, Mondo. I still don't understand that last question is what privileges would a board member lose? I guess that's my question.
You can be calling the superintendent on discussions off the agenda item. You can't, you have to focus on the district's business of what currently is going forward. And that would be, if there's an agenda item, then you could ask questions, you could attend that meeting and vote. You can't just go off and call him on, a
Okay.
barn or some other stuff,
So
if that's not an agenda item.
AJ, I have a question, being that, so the board as a whole has to label the behavior unethical, not just one member?
Yeah.
Like the first part.
The board does not have, the board members don't have that authority.
So the board, when you say a particular behavior is unethical, the board out in open session has to have an item to say that this behavior is unethical.
Yeah, the statement read, the board has concerns about repeated unethical behavior of a board member. What should the board as a whole do?
I would
Not a
recommend.
board member has concerns, the board has concerns.
And
The
that was
board
my
would-
question. Who's labeling the unethical behavior? And the board as a whole. It's not one member of a board looking at another member of a board and saying, you're being unethical. Well, that doesn't really mean anything. Because if you ask another board member, I don't think it's unethical. I don't really, So I guess that's where the team, if you will, needs to be able to hold each other accountable on when you're saying the teeth. Here are our behaviors that we want to represent to our community. And if you're outside of these behaviors, we're going to label them unethical. And I think that's when what I was hearing from the phone is like, now it's individual as a board where they have that right to vote individually as unethical.
Yes, the board as a whole could come to the conclusion, we believe this behavior is repeated and unethical.
You know, if I may, AJ.
Yeah.
So the whole essence of the unethical behavior, if it's in inappropriate communication with other board members and staff, obviously the repercussions of that is we're going to limit your ability to do that.
The privileges you've been extended in this domain are not absolute. They're not rights. They are in fact privileges.
Exactly. And so we can, start by doing limitations of that. You can't direct questions to staff directly. You can't direct questions at the superintendent directly, at our auditor directly, at our legal counsel directly. You must go through the proper channels. In this case, contact the board or the board chair or the officers before initiating, or that you can initiate requests, but you don't have that privilege has now been curtailed.
So this is an interesting thought that Sergio brings up. What do you all think about that?
AJ?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead. I guess in a perfect world, that sounds great. And we don't live in a perfect world. I think I'm following what Sergio said, that I think we have the right to question. I have no problem with the time, if they say 2 to 3 minutes, if they say it to everyone, not just to one person, which not necessarily happens. But I think that's, if it becomes a standard, that makes it not like targeted,
Yeah.
But I don't, again, the board, it's a majority of the board that will operate. And what TEA has always said too, and I believe and I do not know, and I'd acquiesce to you, AJ, is if you have a dissenting opinion, it doesn't mean it's the end of the world.
If there's never a dissenting opinion on the board, that to me is a version of dysfunctionality. I would expect with 7 people that somebody's going to have a difference of agreement at some point.
But the thing is, it shouldn't be then, a dissenting opinion should not result in lack of privileges, is what I'm trying to say.
I don't think anyone is suggesting that dissenting
all right.
opinions
Okay, then I'm fine. I'm fine with everything that was
are
said.
unethical.
Okay.
Unless that's how you all feel, but I would advise you against labeling dissenting opinions as on a board item as being unethical. Like if 6 people vote that way and I vote this direction, nothing about that to me is inherently unethical. Now, my vote could be unethical if I have an interest and I don't disclose that interest. Then my vote itself could be unethical. But simply dissenting on something, just in isolation, no, I don't see a scenario where that is unethical. Now, again, if I have an interest in something and I don't disclose that interest, then I think I am behaving unethically, regardless of how I vote. But just voting differently than everyone else on an item, I don't see that as unethical at all.
And the one other thing I think that might add a little bit more clarification, and going back to what Dr. Galavi said, is, and I don't know whether this would just be as in staff development or if it would be in operating procedures, that, the board operating procedures that we tweak, is that because there is some misconception, because the superintendent, we have 2 employees, if I'm right, that I always heard that we only have 2 employees. That's the superintendent and the auditor, So I really think we need to be specific or whatever, saying that, not to call those directly. But then I also, I think it's kind of odd to think that other people are not calling also. So I don't know if we should put that, I don't want it to be put into the operating procedure if nobody's going to listen to it. Do you see what I mean? But I do think that sometimes we do, do knee-jerk reactions, or we do things to get answers. And I get it that it's not the right way to do it, but I'm wondering if we might need to have a little bit more staff development on that, because I really thought it would, if the school, I thought it was okay to call the superintendent, and I thought it was okay to call the auditor, since they both work for us.
So
So
unless
So I
there
just think
is
it needs
some,
more, yeah. Mhm.
yeah, unless there is something in your policies that I'm not aware of, I can't think of a reason why a board member would be barred from contacting the superintendent. And if you have an internal auditor that reports to the board, contacting the internal auditor like that. But again, those still exist as privileges, not rights.
I get it.
But
Oh,
I don't
okay.
see anything. But I don't see anything in your policies that limits the application of those privileges. It sounds, what I heard, Sergio highlight is a potential policy that would, in fact, create conditions under which those privileges might be limited. But I don't know anything in your current policy manual that limits those privileges.
No, and
I guess, AJ, what I would like you to do is go through those questions, have a scenario, and then, because it goes back, I keep going back to that last question. What privileges what are the consequences if the board deems this unethical? And then give one of the scenarios. And I think going through the whole,
Monica, let's do 4A. So this is a scenario we haven't walked through yet, so I'll bring this up. The staff member says that a board member implied a threat to her job if she didn't do what the board member wanted. What should the employee do? What should the superintendent do? What should the board chair do? What should the board as a whole do? And so, going back to Pedro's question then is, what should happen? I mean, this is essentially the question he's asking is, in a situation like this, what should happen? What should the employee do? What should the superintendent do? What should the board chair do? What should the board as a whole do? So what do you all say? What say you?
you want me to go first?
Yeah, go for it.
So what should the employee do? The employee should report that to whether it's their principal and or the superintendent.
So their supervisor.
Yeah, the superintendent should then do their research in regards to the actual, was there a threat? What actually happened?
So the superintendent should investigate the board member.
Well, they should investigate. They should collect as much information to provide that information to the board.
Gotcha. So the employee should report to their supervisor a circumstance, and who will report to their supervisor. Eventually, it lands on the superintendent's desk. The superintendent should collect all relevant information they have about that, and then the superintendent should do what?
Report that to the board, and then
report it to the board at the next board meeting
in a Friday packet, and then possibly. I mean, I think transparency is key, right? So the first thing is to report it, hopefully in a Friday packet, and then address it at the next board meeting.
All right. Anyone else? What should the employee do? Superintendent, board chair, board as a whole.
And then the board as a whole should look at what Mr. Coronado had proposed and what I was talking about earlier in regards to losing your privileges. Or some privileges, depending on what is defined from the board as what to lose.
Anyone else? Thoughts on this scenario? What should the employee do? What should the superintendent do? What should the board chair do? What should the board as a whole do?
AJ?
Yeah.
Okay. Employee, absolutely speak to the supervisor. The employee also could be guided in showing the policy whenever there's a complaint, how that employee wants to handle the complaint. Do they want to grieve? Do they want to submit a grievance? You have to allow that. So I think that whole avenue has to be, made available to the employee.
Yeah, so employees should be told their rights under grievance policy. That is a right that are, by the way, in case you are not aware, are inalienable rights afforded to all school district employees.
Absolutely.
You cannot sidestep an employee's right to grieve, and ultimately to grieve all the way up to the board. Those are rights. I think it's Chapter 21 of Texas Education Code, and you don't have the option of honoring those rights.
And I think that's what the employee should have been told immediately, you know what I mean? Because that gives them, and going back to what Mr. Rodriguez said, that's an absolutely transparent way of doing it. If you put it in writing and said this happened and this is it, period, then you have a trail you can follow. Then the superintendent can say, to the board, we have a grievance filed, it's a level 1. And hopefully a level 1, it never gets to the board. It stays either level 1 or 2. But guess what? If it gets to the board as a level 3, then the board hears it. And then the board can make a decision, especially if it's went through a formal process like a grievance. Then they can just say, and then they can decide, you know what? Okay, this was wrong. Let's not, and then the chair, then the whole board looks at it, not just the chair, the whole board looks at it and says, and you just either, and I don't think there's anything, I think you always try first with the least restrictive environment, which is admonish or just say that wasn't the right thing to do. If this continues, then you can say you would have a loss of privileges. So I do think is to try to correct the behavior, as educators. Maybe I'm being too much of an educator.
No, I think it's spot on.
You try to correct the behavior and you do it the right way. I never took grievances as, you have to get into the frame of mind that grievances are not against you. It's something that somebody's viewing. It's a grievance. It's how they feel. And when you're dealing with feelings, it can be strange. So I think following a process like that is the best way to do it. But I do think to just jump all of a sudden to jump and says, okay, you're going to lose privileges. When we're having a hard time defining what privileges are, that I think that might not be the best thing. I think by saying, listen, this is what we would like to see in the future. We'd like to see this action corrected. And, and then don't bring it up 3 years again, 3 years after it was corrected. And because you say, okay, we talked about this before, if it's, so I do think we have to use common sense and definitely look for the most efficient way to handle it, that it's like, that everybody knows it's the right way to handle it.
So there are a few things that you said that I think are important to highlight. One, I think you said that if there is a grievance, even if it's a level 1 grievance, that if the grievance involves a board member, the board should be notified.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's one thing I heard. Another thing I heard is that it sounds like you distinguish between admonition and a censure, in that you're saying that ideally an admonishment happens before we get to the point of having a conversation about censure. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, exactly, sir.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really clear direction.
It's like what we did as, how when you have a progressive
discipline, yeah.
It's progressive discipline. It's the same thing. You just don't automatically put a hammer down. Yeah. You want to correct the behavior first and then give an avenue to show the remediation's been successful.
Yeah, got it.
I don't see if an employee, if a board threatens a staff and they're internally, I know what we do internally, but now you have an outside entity, which is the board, which are not employees.
True.
And I don't see I know we went through this and said, hey, I want the board to apologize to employees. I guess I'm questioning, I don't know. I think it needs to jump high and just a level 1.
AJ.
Oh, I didn't think of that.
It's just because of the board.
So I want to clarify. So you're thinking if there is an allegation directly regarding the board, that it should not actually go to a level 1, it should go straight to a level 3.
Correct.
Yep, yes, I think because then, well, not even a level 3, it should go straight directly to the
Straight to the
board
board.
because that employee, out of fear, may not want to file a level 1 grievance.
You're right.
But now you
Gotcha.
have this on your table with this happening. Now you have to do something because if not, the behavior is going to continue.
Good
For
point.
For fear of being a bully, for fear of abuse of power. So once you have that abuse of power, then I think the level of action should meet that same level. If not, then that employee is going to go through, okay, I don't agree with level 1. Let's go to level 2. I don't think the process should be the same as an employee when it comes to a board member.
Okay.
AJ,
Yeah, Armando.
I have 2 examples, right? In regards to the current situation that brought us here, I think my going back to what Ms. Brigham said, those options should have provided earlier. And I think there's a lot more. And the reason why I was saying is that data, and I prefer what Dr. Galavi said, is that should have been collected and then presented as a level 3 grievance instead of, from my understanding, getting the direction from a fellow colleague that has a personal agenda against another board member to file a TA grievance or a TA complaint instead of following this. So you have the current situation that we're in, right? But then you also have when you have a board member calling and threatening the superintendent or staff on the same issue, let's say, or the other complaint, right? The barn issue, you have an employee, and there's emails on this where you have my colleagues threatening the superintendent on issues that have already been voted on, right? And so I think addressing them in the way that Mr. Coronado said, yeah, we could give, we're seasoned board members. We've had 4 years, but I understand let's, censor a new board member that did it their first time. But no, you've been on the board 4 years. You know what your role is, and you continue to do it. I mean, there's factual information. That's why I'm thinking all that information needs to be presented in a factual way, because the TA complaint was only one-sided. And so I think the grievance process would have allowed that employee to provide all that information and then have a hearing where it would be more, you would be able to hear the whole story. Like, did that employee have any contact with any other board members? Like questions like that, So I think a censorship would work if it's just, your first month on the job and you're not listening or whatever, right? But if you've been on the board 2 years and you know what your role is, then I think there needs to be consequences on how you approach administration, the superintendent, and employees.
One of the things that I think the question that you lift up is, whose responsibility is it for board members to know what the policies and procedures are? Is that the board's responsibility? Does their responsibility to know that kick in after 2 years, after 4 years, after the 4th term? But I think that's a reasonable question, is, when do we expect board members to know how to behave effectively as board members? We've been in this conversation for a couple hours now, and we're about to wind down. I want to certainly be respectful of your time, but we do have next steps, and our intention from here is, again, that Monica and I will take all the notes that we've captured from this conversation, and we will send you some proposed amendments to your board operating procedures regarding ethical standards for school board members. And so, again, if you have additional feedback or insights that you'd like us to be contemplating as we put together that proposal for you, then just go ahead and send that to us now. Email either of us, and will sometime in the next 3 days. And then, beyond that, it's probably too late because we'll be deep into the work. But anytime in the next 3 days, feel free to send us any type of feedback you have via email, or give one or both of us a call. We're happy to just continue to take ideas, but then we will offer you back something that will help be responsive to the conversation that you've had here today, the conversation you had at the last session, and that positions you to be responsive to the items in your corrective action plan, so that we can kind of get that dispensed with as quickly as possible. Any questions about these next steps? Questions about what happens next in this process?
I have a question. I guess we'll be developing a policy, hopefully, in regards to some type of accountability.
And so what'll happen, Monica and I will take our notes from all of this, and we'll sit down and we'll put together a proposed set of amendments to your board operating procedures based on the conversations that we've heard here today. And then we'll provide those back to you all, and then you all will have to decide what to do with them, keep, modify, whatever.
In regards to accountability, if a board member does not decide to participate in LSG governance, what accountability is TA going to put, since they're the ones that have created or had made us approve a corrective action plan, which the board approved?
As the person who used to be responsible for corrective action plans at the agency, I would strongly encourage you not to violate your word. You have made a commitment. I would strongly encourage you, honor your word. This is a matter of integrity, and I would strongly encourage you to, as a board, to act with integrity. I do not know, while I hired and trained by replacement, I don't know if he will be as uncompromising as I would have been in the same circumstance. But if people actually give me their word in writing that they're going to do something, my expectation is that they will honor their word. And if they don't, then I will respond in a manner commensurate with people who thoroughly lack integrity.
Can I address that issue?
Yeah.
To that extent, and I understand the importance of it, but in the times that we're living at right now, a lot of us are very hesitant to even, participate in a meeting like this, or the LSG meetings that I've been to, because of what's going on, health-wise.
So two things. One, if there are extenuating circumstances, my encouragement to you is to have that conversation with the person you gave your word to. But I would not violate my word and not have a prior conversation with the person I gave my word to. So that's step one. If I know that I'm not going to honor my word, I would be talking about that before I didn't honor my word, not after I didn't honor my word. Second, I literally led a workshop this weekend.
In person.
In person. With people who, at least one board member who I suspect has elements that eclipse anything you all are struggling with. But we went out of our way to create appropriate conditions in which that could happen. And the list of the list of accommodations was pretty significant, but we got it done, and people had it. Folks had a great time, and we're glad they did. And they already want to schedule another 2-day in-person retreat for a few months from now. And so so there are two issues. One, if I'm not going to honor my word, I want to have that conversation with the person who I gave my word to long before I honor my word, before I dishonor my word. Second, I would just be looking at what are all the possible avenues for actually honoring my word. And there are a bunch of different options. Now, whether those options make sense for you all or not, that's on you all. But I would not put myself in a position to have told someone, here's what I commit to. I'm giving you my word, like, man to man, this is what I've committed to do.
I guess, Mr. AJ, what would be some accommodations allowed? Because right now
And
we
then
just
having said,
know,
those are my two of March. I am responsible for corrective action plans.
Again,
Dr. Galavis, or the board president, I'm okay in understanding the current situation and looking at that in regards to accommodating that or looking at future dates. But we currently have a board member that does not want to participate, and the reason being,
I'm assuming for health.
no, I'm talking about Ms. Searles does not want to participate at all, from my understanding.
Yeah, like I said, if you all have health concerns, I would
No,
communicate that.
AJ,
Uh,
this isn't a health concern. It's more of, I'm not going to participate.
Well, then I don't know what to tell you. I know that if I was still the deputy commissioner responsible for that, I would be entirely unconvinced by a school system that says they want to independently govern themselves, but are unwilling to honor their word.
Okay. Dr.
AJ?
Galavis, can you
Oh.
confirm that?
pardon?
Can you confirm that? Ms. Searles does not want to participate.
Yes, I'll confirm it. However, I think the board needs to discuss it at the next board meeting because it's a big, it depends. So wanting to willfully not participate due to health or willfully intentionally not wanting to participate because, of other things. So
Yeah, and that's why I said if someone is suggesting it's a health related phenomenon, then I would encourage you to have that conversation sooner rather than later. I don't know that it'll be convincing because, like I said, I literally just did an in-person workshop this weekend where health concerns were a major consideration, and we took extensive measures to protect the health of all of the trustees present. Fairly extensive, measures. It was a very large room. We were very far apart from each other, and a whole bunch of other things. There were plastic partitions. There were HVAC concerns. There were masks. There were, staff came through and wiped down at every break. I mean, it was extensive, the measures that were taken. But that's what the board chose to do, and so that's what we did. And so just know that it has been done. You would not be the first.
Yeah, AJ? AJ,
Yeah.
I know that what I did, and I know I asked Ms. Camacho to personally notify Monica at Region 19 for specific criteria as far as, I just don't want to go to a meeting and feel unsafe, number one.
Yeah.
I do believe, and I don't want to go to a meeting, and if I'm isolated, I don't want to be chastised by fellow board members because I'm in a separate area.
Oh, no.
Because,
That would be inappropriate. That would be entirely
valid
inappropriate.
concerns I have about going because
Yeah.
I have to, take care of somebody
Yeah,
that's
it would be
extremely ill.
entirely inappropriate to create a
Okay.
situation where you were chastised or separate. And so again, in this situation, all 7 trustees were separated. And in fact, we had to mic everybody because people were so far apart that everybody had to be mic'd. So that's the way that, we communicated.
Yeah.
It's
So
extraordinary circumstances.
So it is all right for me to specifically call Ms. Paloma and just say, these are some of the things I need. And I just don't want to be
And let's
slapped
design for it.
down. Okay. I can do that
that's the way
today. I can do that today. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's the way I handled the session this past weekend is, the lady who is dealing with kind of respiratory circumstances and her husband is dealing with even more severe respiratory
Absolutely.
circumstances. Like this is a major, major concern. She would not have shown up if we didn't address all of the health related concerns that she and her husband had. And so those were taken seriously, but all trustees were treated the exact same way. You know, they are all put in their little plastic boxes, essentially. You know, they're like everybody had their own table and were kind of encased in their own little, you know, plexiglass box. You know, and they were all mic'd up, and so that's how we could hear people. It was a whole production, but it was important to them that they came together as a team in person, you know, to do this work, and so it got done.
I appreciate you saying that. It makes me feel a little bit more comfortable in requesting just space.
Oh yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
because it's absolutely imperative that is done for me to attend.
Yeah, you got to take it seriously.
Okay, thank you, Monica. I will get with you.
So AJ, I just want to be clear so the board understands that it's all 8 of us attending this LSG training. So
Yeah.
it's just not a quorum. It's all 8
Mhm.
that are.
So there's honoring your word, and there's not honoring your word. If you want to honor your word, the team of 8 shows up for the workshop. If you want to lack integrity, you know, as a district, then the team of 8 does not appear for the workshop. Those are the options. And you should expect that like I said, I don't work there anymore, so I don't know. But I did train the people who do now occupy the position. I hired and trained my own replacement. And I suspect he will be as uncompromising as I would be. If you give me your word that you're going to do something, I expect that you'll honor it. And if you dishonor your word in these things, that tells me that you'll probably dishonor your word regarding your students and other things. And now I've got bigger questions about your suitability.
I have an issue with that.
Yeah.
Okay. Because bottom line, my health comes before anything else.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And you know, it's not a matter of
it's
not a matter of integrity, AJ. Because I gave my word 2 years ago when I started, and I went to it. And that second year, I gave my word and I went to it. The circumstances now are that my health is more important to me than anything else.
As well it should be.
So
health and family first.
Exactly. But saying you're putting it in a matter of I'm lacking integrity if I don't show up.
It doesn't mean my recommendation to you is absolutely, if it's me in your position, I put my health and family first. I'm not, however, under the understanding that my choices, you know, don't have consequences.
Exactly.
Choices absolutely have consequences, which is why my first recommendation was, before I'm not going to honor my word, I would definitely have a conversation with whoever I gave my word to.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So still state, just black and white. This is, I am going to do it. I'm not going to do it. So
Yeah,
that the
and
person
then
knows.
whatever consequence comes from that.
Yes, I get it. Yeah. Okay.
And
But I think you have better chances when you actually have that conversation up front than when you just simply don't honor your word and never had a conversation about it.
Right.
I think, if may I please, I do understand the critical situation that all of us were going through. And I do respect each one of us, definitely, because all of us, I guess, like Miss Annette, she has to take care of someone. Mr. Leon, because if it says his health and age. And Mr. Rodriguez, I know that he has to take care of his mom. I do too. I have a person that recently had a surgery and he's not a young chicken too. So I do understand either me and him, we could put at risk. But I also do understand that all the provisions are going to be taken care of. And I need to trust and I need to be positive. Of course, that I'm going to take all the provisions necessary to take care of this. And also, I do remember when I decided to run for a board member, it's our operating procedures that it says that I'm going to seek for education. And this is one of the best opportunities that we have, all of us, to be together, to clear everything. If we have any question or misunderstood of communications, this training is made especially for that. And it's a good thing that we take it. And it's a good thing that you decide to give it to us in this time. Thank you, AJ. Thank you, Ms. Haloma. But I think it's very necessary for us as a board members to take it due to the situation that we have on a board. I think it's necessary for all of us. And of course, like you said, honor my word, but it's okay as well. You know what, I'm not gonna go. I think all of us, we need to have an attention to one another, not because I have to tell you, it's because of integrity, it's because of communication, it's because of willing to do it. And you know what? I'm not going to be able to go because of this and this and that. We are a team, we're a group. And I think we need to be communicated. I think this situation is going to get us more closer than separating. For whatever the reason it is, we understand what we need to respect each one's decision and also what situation has been going on. But also we need to be communicating one another. And this is a wonderful opportunity to participate and to get closer. Thank you.
Okay.
And, so we've gone through all the topics that, Monica and I had planned for you. And I say Monica and I, really, I mean, Monica, all the topics that Monica planned for you. I just do what I'm told. She's the brains of the operation. And so we've gone through the entire slideshow that she's designed, the curriculum she's designed for you all. We've got the feedback we need. And I think you also had some extra questions about the larger process. And so we tried to be responsive to those. And so with that, formally, Monica, did you have anything else that you needed to jump in here with?
Thank you.
We couldn't hear you, Monica.
Oh, no, that was it. We've completed everything we needed to do. So that's it for me.
So board
Can you
chair,
hear
back to
me?
you.
Hello?
Yeah, but you faded in and out, Monica.
Mr. Chair, back to you.
All right, thank you, AJ. All right, board, we've concluded this training. I think it's, I will be in touch with Dr. Galaviz and Monica to decide how we're going to handle. We're scheduled for the 23rd. We're going to take into account these situations that have come up. We will be in touch with the board. We want to get commitments from everybody as to what is going to happen. And also, I guess, get with Ms. Paloma to see about the safety precautions that can be taken where we're going to meet on the 23rd, I believe. So we will be in touch with everyone about the next training that we're required to do. Thank you, AJ. Thank you, Ms. Paloma. We appreciate
Nice meeting you, AJ.
your input and your direction in this, and we look forward to hearing about the proposal that is coming. And of course, each board member can request or make suggestions. You can send them to AJ and Ms. Paloma, or you can send them to Dr. Galaviz or myself. We'll make sure that they get forwarded on. But I guess it'd be easier to send them directly to Ms. Paloma and AJ. So with that, I think that takes care of our agenda item. Is Ms. Camacho back on?
Yes.
She is.
All right. Anything further from the board? Any questions, concerns? No? Okay.
Okay.
Ms. Camacho, next agenda.
Adjournment, it's 10:45.
All right, by unanimous consent of the board, hearing nothing else, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone, for
Remember,
your participation.
be safe, get your flu shot, get a flu shot.
Oh, gee, we're gonna try to do that today. You take care.
Take care, everybody.
Be safe.
Bye.